All right. Well, welcome everyone. It's so good to see you all. If this is your first time attending, then thank you so much for trying us out, our virtual Coffee with a Curator program hosted by the Bentley Rare Book Museum. If you've been attending, which I think pretty much everyone here has been attending, thank you so much again for making this a part of your Wednesday each month. So I wanted to also say a big happy Black History Month to everyone. I love February, not only because it's my birthday month, but also, of course, because it is Black History Month. In case you all don't know, I wanted to give a little bit on the history of Black History Month, just a tad. It was first launched by the historian and writer Carter G. Woodson, who was the founder of the Association for the Study of Negro Life and History, which now is the Association for the Study of African American Life and History. In 1926, Dr. Woodson launched Negro History Week, and then about 50 years later, ASALH decided to expand that to Black History Month. And then 10 years after that, Congress deemed February as National Black History Month. So today we're going to intersect Black History Month with book collecting. We are specifically going to discuss the fascinating concept of a first edition, fascinating and kind of perplexing concept. We're going to hear from Lori Meadows, our faithful attendee who is a book collector and an advisor to a bookseller. She's going to give us a broad overview of the concept of a first edition. And then next, we are going to tie in Black History Month as we hear from Mr. Bill Berger, who has been collecting books for about 40 years, I think.
Yeah, more than that.
More than that. So very, very lucky to have him here with us today. And in 2019, he donated a marvelous collection of African-American first editions to the Bentley Rare Book Museum. So we're going to talk specifically about that marvelous collection that we have, and just in general, some of his experiences collecting. But first, before we officially begin, we are going to have our Andrew segment. I don't know what else to call it. But each month, Andrew will change his background to a bookish place. And usually it has to do with the theme. So sometimes he gives us clues, sometimes not. So Andrew, would you like to introduce your place today, or at least a clue to your place today?
So this one is actually a quite unique library, and it is connected to Black History Month.
Okay.
Outside of that, I might give it away. So
Sure. Okay. So it's in America then, I think.
yes,
Okay. Is it well, maybe I should ask, a personal library, or
it is not a personal library. No,
it's not a personal library. Okay. Oh, is this the, well, I don't know if they have one there, but is it a library at the National Museum of African American History and Culture?
it is not. No,
Oh, okay. I wasn't sure if they had one or not.
I
Schomburg.
think I did that last February for
Oh,
background.
you did? Okay, they do. It's a Schomburg. Well, that isn't, is it?
Let me move around a bit so you can kind of get a better view of it.
Okay. So it's not the Schomburg.
No,
Okay. Interesting. Is it at an HBCU?
it is not. No,
Hmm. Hmm.
Is it a public library?
it's not actually a public library. No,
So it's an academic library.
it's. I think it's like a private library. It has like reference collection,
It has like a
a
reference.
research library. Yeah,
Oh. Oh, is it Auburn Avenue?
it's not. No,
Well, I guess that would be a public library, so that wouldn't really work. Um, I don't know why I'm not getting it, but
Let's narrow it down geographically. Is it in the eastern half of the United States or the western half?
it is in the eastern half.
Not that that helps.
well, it kind of, because maybe you can tell us northeast or southeast, or
Southeast.
Okay, it is in the Southeast, so that's helpful.
Okay.
Okay. I really want to get this one. Okay, it's in the Southeast and it's kind of like a private research library.
Is it in the state of Alabama?
It's not.
Is it here in Georgia?
It's not, no.
Okay, it's not. Okay, I don't feel as bad.
I will say,
Is
I thought this might be one people would guess pretty easily.
I know,
it in
but
the-
well,
is it in the state of Kentucky?
It's not Kentucky, but that's a bit close.
Let's see.
What'd you say, Sue?
Tennessee.
It is Tennessee, yes.
Ah,
is it in Memphis?
Not Memphis.
Oh,
It's
Nashville.
not in a major Tennessee city.
Yeah. Okay.
Hmm. Um, I don't know. Nothing's coming to mind. I don't know if anyone, and Maggie's not here. She usually has Googled it by now.
I've managed to, I think, Google it.
Oh, you have, Christian?
Yeah, it's the Langston Hughes Library.
Oh,
It
I
is.
actually didn't know
Yeah.
about that in Tennessee, so I wouldn't have gotten that.
It's in Clinton, Tennessee, on the
Oh.
Alex Haley farm.
Oh, okay. I actually hadn't heard of that place, so no wonder. That's really cool. Oh my goodness. Well, thank you, Andrew.
You're welcome.
Yeah, that's a good one because I really hadn't heard about it. Yay. Well, thank you so much for that. So in the spirit of games, as we get started, I'm going to see if I can, to preface Lori's presentation, I'm going to see if I can launch a poll. It's just one question. Hopefully it will work, but let's see if I can. Okay, I can launch it. Okay. Before I launch it, and whoever wants to participate can, but my question, this one question poll. Okay, so think about your favorite book in the entire world. And let's say someone was able to offer you several different copies of it, but you can only pick one. And they want you to pick the one that you think would be most desirable or most valuable. So you get to pick one. And so I'd like you all to select which copy of this book you would pick. So let me try to launch this poll. Let me see. Well, I had it and now it went away. Okay, here we go. So first edition, first printing, first edition, first impression, limited edition, or first edition thus. And again, this is kind of what you would pick. So there's not really a right or wrong answer here. And it's okay that if you don't know what all these mean because we haven't talked about anything yet. So I just wanted to see what people would pick. All right. Has everyone who wanted to participate, have they all participated? I think so. Perfect. Okay. So I think you all can probably see the results now. So I think the majority of people would pick first edition, first printing. We had a little first edition, a little bit of first edition, first impression, and a little limited edition. Very cool. I just wanted to see what people would pick. Okay. Sounds good. That was just for fun, but we're going to learn more about what all those terms mean. And I wanted to just go ahead and preface before Lori gets started. It's hard to define a first edition. It really is hard to come up with a definition that encompasses the complexity of it. But there's a wonderful book that I highly recommend if you don't have it already. John Carter's ABCs for Book Collectors. I have the 9th edition that has pictures, and it's really great. But in that book, there is a pretty succinct definition that says, quote, very, very roughly speaking, this means the first appearance of the work in question independently between its own covers, end quote. So that's just a very basic concept of a first edition. But of course, this term is complicated by other terms like issue, impressions, state, advanced copies, book of the month club editions, all sorts of things. Another thing that I think is really interesting that tends to complicate the idea of a first edition, which is very specific to African, well, not specific to, but tends to appear a lot in African American texts, is I just want to show one example that I thought was really, really interesting. And it relates to the collection that Mr. Berger donated to us. Okay, so this is a cover of Alice Walker's In Search of Our Mother's Gardens, which was published in 1983. And again, Mr. Berger donated this text to us. And on the copyright page, it says first edition. So it is a stated first edition. But the interesting thing about this book is it's a compilation of essays that were published between, sorry about that, it's my computer making beeps. Published between 1966 and 1982. And one of the most lauded essays in this book is called Looking for Zora. It's about Zora Neale Hurston, and that essay was largely responsible for kind of reviving interest in Zora Neale Hurston's work. That essay was published in MS Magazine in 1975. So even though this book is in its first edition, the essay already appeared somewhere earlier. So again, sometimes that brings into question, well, what is the first edition? What is the first edition of the essay? So anyway, I wanted to show just that example because that happens a lot with, especially with essays and poetry and things like that. And also, if you're curious about the first appearance of Looking for Zora, I'm going to go ahead and put it in the chat because MS Magazine did a special on it not too long ago. But Lori's going to help us understand all of this a lot more. So Lori, would you like to go ahead and take it away?
I'd be happy to. Thank you, Joellen. Hi, everybody. My name is Lori Meadows, and I'm a staff member here at KSU. Thank you for joining us, and I'm going to go ahead and give a short presentation on understanding and collecting first editions. Joellen, is it okay if I go ahead and share my screen?
Yes, please.
Great.
Do.
Thank you. Let's see if I get the right one. I have a 33% chance. Okay, I think we got it. Great. So I've created a little slide deck.
Let's see, Lori. Here we go. Sorry.
There we go. Is that better?
Got it.
I had one more button to hit. So I've been collecting for probably over 30 years. And my husband also had a small personal library that married my library when we got married. And we have a house full of books. They just kind of let us live there. But over the years, I have learned a lot about first editions, what makes a first edition, what makes a book collectible. And I have served in an advisory capacity to his small online bookstore on occasion. And I'm just going to share a little bit with you about what I know about first editions. It's a fun topic. So the first thing, as Joellen mentioned, is there's a big issue with the term first edition because depending on the context, it means different things to different people. A publisher considers a first edition to be the first time they put content into print without any significant revisions. And if you think of like academic books or textbooks or dictionaries, even cookbooks, especially older cookbooks, that maybe the content has changed over time. Publishers and authors will occasionally issue a subsequent edition to encapsulate those content changes, and those are very, very useful. For example, in the medical field, of course, you would want to read the most current edition of a book so that you are up to date on things. Literature is pretty fixed. You have classics, but reference books will generally, as the knowledge on that topic expands, they will add that knowledge to the book, the body of the book. But that requires like a second edition or even a third or fourth be created and distributed to the public. Now, a collector and bookseller definition of first edition is very different. The book culture has a first edition is code between booksellers and collectors and booksellers. And if we see the term first edition, we are assuming that that is a first edition, first impression of a book. Now, an impression is actually also known as the print run. So you will see those terms used interchangeably, but if it doesn't say anything about the impression number or the print run number, we're going to make the assumption as seasoned booksellers and collectors that the description is referring to a first edition, first impression. Anything after that by that publisher is automatically considered a later printing, even a second edition. Now, there are certain exceptions to desirability rules for second and third edition. It just depends on, second and third impression, rather. It just depends on how scarce that first is, and if it is obtainable. Sometimes we have to default to a second impression for collecting purposes. And by the way, I have built in a little time for Q&A at the end, but if you have any questions, please drop them in the chat. Maybe Joy Ellen can help me monitor those, and I'll be happy to answer as we go along. So there are several different types of first editions. The true first is, of course, the preferred collectible book in the collecting world, but that is a publisher's original print date. That is the first time that book came off the press anywhere. So that is usually the most valuable copy. I'm going to try to refrain from actually getting deep into valuation, but that, let's just say, that is a very desirable copy normally of any book. Reprint first editions, if you look at a book that has gone into reprint through other publishers, that printing still has a first edition. Every reprint has a first edition, but the reprints are never going to be the true first. So it's the responsibility, we're going to talk about roles and responsibilities in a little bit, but it's up to the buyer to do some research to figure out, hey, is this a reprint, or is this like really the first time this was ever in print? First thus is also a collectible first edition. That is, and Joy Ellen mentioned this in the intro, that is when material, and it doesn't have to be printed. It can be printed, it can be on the screen, it can be in music or on the stage. The first time somebody captures that in a bound volume, that is a first thus. And first thuses are a very close second in desirability to true first, because they've adapted something that was not previously in book form and put it into book form. Advanced review copies are kind of cool, not terribly collectible unless you perhaps are what we call a completist, which is a particular flavor of collector who likes to collect everything about that book. And that would include advanced review copies. And those were typically printed. They can be bound like a regular book. or sometimes they're paperback. It just depends on the publisher and how broad the distribution was. But those are usually given to book critics or possibly other authors to receive a critique or a review or an endorsement that they can then put on a subsequent printing of their book. So anytime you see a blurb by a famous author on the back of another book that you're reading, that person, that author, received an advance review copy, and that allowed them, most likely, that allowed them to read the book and give an opinion on it. And if it's favorable, then the author of the book you're reading would really like to, put that endorsement. It's kind of like an advertisement. So those are a few types of first editions. Moving right along, a few tips for identifying first editions. Now, I would like to say this list is not comprehensive. These are just things that if you get in the habit of looking for while you are shopping, it'll help you kind of hone your first edition identification skills. So sometimes you will see the words first edition printed on the copyright page, and I am going to presume that this group is aware of where the copyright page lives in the book. For anybody that doesn't know, it's normally on the back of the title page, on the verso of the title. So you may also see first printing in the text of a copyright page. If you see first printing, you can safely assume that is a first edition, first printing. It doesn't necessarily mean it's a true first, though, because if it's a reprint, remember what we said a minute ago, it's just going to be a first rather than a true first. First American edition simply means that the content of that book was published in a different country before it was printed here. That maybe 99% of the time, but because sometimes they do publish simultaneously in different countries. So you really have to do some research to figure those out. But it is safe to say that another copy of this book lives in another country before it was released in America. First trade edition simply means this is the first mass commercial printing. Sometimes you'll see first mass market paperback or first trade edition. That just means it was probably a pretty sizable print run. The number line. In modern books, you'll see a number line, and again, we could do a whole session on this by itself, and I'm going to try to pick up the pace a little bit because I'm going to run out of time. So number lines, if you see a 1 or an A, some publishers use alphabet instead of numbers, that means that is a first impression of that first edition. And there's some good resources on the web to teach you how to read a number line if you don't know. And the last point is you won't see any references to movie tie-ins or awards that the book has won normally, or mainstream book clubs like Oprah's book club or Reese Witherspoon's book club. You won't see that labeling on the cover of the book. If you see that, there's a pretty good chance that is not a first impression. Okay, so we want to remember that. Now, book culture, very quickly. There is a culture in the book loving world, in the book selling world. Sellers, we really like, as collectors, we really like for them to provide detail in their book listings, because especially if we're buying online, rather than from a printed catalog, we ask for accuracy in the written descriptions, and we really love sellers that are willing to answer questions and provide additional information if we feel that some is lacking. Buyers have responsibilities too, and that is, if you have a question, please ask it. If you don't feel like you have enough information to make a good purchasing decision, reach out to the seller. If they are non-responsive, you don't have to buy the book from them. You can certainly go to a different bookseller. You're not obligated. If they don't respond, don't waste a lot of time on it. Try to find a different copy. But it is good practice to be responsive to inquiries from potential buyers. The more expensive the book is, I encourage you to increase the number of questions that you ask. And if you ever need help with that, just let me know and I'll try to guide you through. You do have some recourse in some online sales platforms of returning a book that was not as it was described in the listing that you based your purchase on, but you'll need to check the rules of the platform that you're buying from. Now, these are tricky books. I call these tricky books. Books that look like they're first editions, but they're really not. Now, book club editions, there is an exception. There are a small handful of books that were actually printed in book club form first before they hit the mainstream. So those are pretty rare, though. But as a rule, BCEs are not terribly valuable unless the original book is very scarce to find, the non-BCE. And they're not terribly collectible. A lot of people will use full-size book club editions as placeholders until they, especially if they're full-size, because they can, they improve the shelf appeal because it makes the set, it's a filler, basically a seat filler. But there are a couple of exceptions to collectability or collectible book clubs and valued book clubs. But quick identification, there's not a price on the dust jacket anywhere. There may be the number line may be absent, is probably absent. Book club editions, especially mid-century, tended to be smaller. They were trimmed in size. So if you see a small book that doesn't have a price, then you know you're handling a book club edition. And then sometimes they're marked. I mean, they may say this is, a book of the month club or a book club edition or some kind of indicator that it's book club. In the old days, I don't know that they still do this though. There used to be a very small blind stamp on the back board, the outside of the back board, that you could just kind of feel that the publisher put there to communicate silently that that's a book club, in case it ever got separated from the jacket. Because if you don't have the jacket, it's a lot harder to figure out. Now, again, the caveat, some modern book clubs are full size and some of them contain number lines. And if you get one of those, it can be really confusing, especially if it doesn't have a jacket, because that jacket is what you're relying on to see if there's a price. Another book that looks like a first edition, but it isn't ever, is a print-on-demand book. That is a copy. It's not even really a facsimile because it's not authorized. These are, a lot of times they're bound in leather. They're really pretty to look at. You can read them. They're not worth a whole lot. You will see some exorbitant prices though, because especially if they're bound in leather. But a lot of times those will come from countries outside of the U.S. So that will, those are usually international sales, and distributed through a local distributor. But a lot of that content is in the public domain. And honestly, if you want just to read it, you could probably go to Google Books and find it, because that's probably where they got it from. So identification, the first tip off for me is if the description contains a publication date of like now, when the content was from the 1800s. Okay, so, and I know the content's from the 1800s, so that's a flag that you may be looking at a print on demand. They never provide a picture because it hasn't been printed yet. And then sometimes in ABE books, for example, they actually have a POD, search elimination, that you can filter so that it won't throw those books up. And there's rarely a decent description with that type of book. Now, one last book that looks like a first, but it isn't a first ever, is a facsimile. And a facsimile is an authorized, a true facsimile is a legitimate, authorized, exact duplicate of the original book. And there may be cases where, oh, Joellen, am I okay on time? I have a few slides left. I'm coming up on my 15-minute.
Yeah, I want
maybe if I hurry.
Yeah, maybe like 5 more minutes or so.
Okay, thank you. You're very kind, and thank you, Mr. Berger. I apologize. So facsimiles are true and faithful reproductions of the content of a book that either doesn't exist anymore, or maybe there's only one. It's one of a kind and it's in fragile state, so it can't be handled. So don't shy away from legitimate facsimiles. I have several in my library, and they're great to refer to for research. Now, if this wasn't complicated enough, we're going to dive into states just really quick. A state is a very small change within the first print run that creates two entities of a first edition. So it like splits into twins. One of them is truer than the other. The one closest to the strike of the die has seniority over a second state. In the case of books, I have an example. I'm just going to gloss over it in a sec. And then I also have book jacket examples. It's really more common in book jackets. There are first edition point lists that are available on the web and in print in other books. So this is a great resource. If you have an author you like, see if there's a list of first edition points that will also help you identify. Tolkien's The Silmarillion, which I lovingly call the Silly Million because there are so many of them. The first state, second state have the exact same copyright page, which is on the left. But on the right, you will see there is some of those letters are missing. That is from the second state of the first edition, first impression. And that the die broke during the first impression, and they just kept right on printing. So if it meets the first edition points, but those letters are missing, that means you have a second state. Okay, so these are just things you learn over time. Examples of first edition dust jacket state, John Green's Happy Margot, Sad Margot is a famous one. Stephen King's Insomnia is another famous one. Red on white, white on red. The book is the same, but the publisher made the decision at the time of the first run that they wanted two different covers, and they may appeal to different markets. It broadens their sellability. Patrick O'Brien's Master and Commander. This is another fun one. He's a British author, was a British author. They normally published in their home country first. However, this British author's book was published in the US first, which caused great consternation in the UK. So we claim it. We actually have this book at home. I love it. But that gives you an example of something that is not normal. It's when they publish outside of their home country. And lastly, one of my favorite academic reads from my undergrad was Chinua Achebe's Things Fall Apart. It's a wonderful story, but this is an example of how many different covers. Now, all of these could be first edition, legitimate first editions, hardcovers, paperbacks. The one on the far left, the green cover, that is the true first. And then the one next to it is a second hard copy that came out after that one. So just look for variety. Variety is not scary. And I think that's it. I think I finished.
Thank you so much, Lori.
Thank
all
you.
the work you put into that.
Very, 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 very nicely done, Lori. I think
Thank
it was
you,
a
Mr.
great primer.
Oh, thank you.
Yes, marvelous. So now we'll turn it over to Mr. Berger, Mr. Bill Berger. And again, we're so grateful for Bill for your expertise in first editions and how you were able to give a wonderful donation to the Rare Book Room. And just to give, for those who don't know, to give you an idea of the authors represented in that collection, they include Maya Angelou, Toni Morrison, Alice Walker, James Baldwin, Gloria Naylor, Ishmael Reed, and Terry McMillan. I have some of the books here with me in my office, kind of some of them here. I also have some wonderful scans of the covers done by our student assistant, Addie. So I might show those while Mr. Berger's talking just for a few minutes. But we'll go ahead and get started. Bill, okay, let's talk about.
Well, let me, if you don't mind, let me follow up a little bit on what Lori said.
Okay, got it.
A little filler. I thought it was really, really well done. I also Joy Ellen, thank you for not requiring me to present a slide deck.
Oh, yes, yeah. We'll just have you just
But in
chat.
any event, let me go back and do, as I say, a little fill. And I'm sure that, this is no reflection on what Laurie did. I thought it was really, really well done. But in terms of collecting, I'm coming from a collector's perspective. That's what I am. I was never a dealer. I never sold books, much to my wife's consternation. But in any event, one of the things that is very difficult if you're really into collecting, say, some older authors, is that the publishers had different ways of identifying first editions in the old days, if I'll call it, going back to the 20s, 30s, 40s. For example, I'll just use Putnam. Putnam, which is still a major publisher, would have on the copyright page, if it was a first edition, first printing, it would say nothing. It would just have the copyright information. That would be true of other publishers as well, until they went in more modern times, and I'm not really sure when that was, when they started going to the number line, and which is what most publishers do now, so they make it easier to identify a first edition, first printing. Along that line, when you see a number line, unless it has a one, with an exception, which I'll mention, it's a first edition, first printing. What the publishers generally do nowadays, and again, I wish I had a better idea of when it started in full force, is that once you went into a subsequent printing, they would drop the number. So if you have a book that starts with a 2 or an 8, it's that printing. It's no longer a first edition, first printing. Random House, and this is something important, Random House never had a 1 on its number line. If it was a first edition, first printing, it said first edition and it started with a 2. Once it went into a subsequent printing, they dropped the word first edition and it became a second printing. So this really confuses people. There are actually a couple of other exceptions I didn't have time to didn't think about. A William Faulkner book, for example, didn't have anything on the copyright page, but it was a first edition, first printing. So that I think, and there are books, and maybe even online now, that talk about how to identify first edition, first printings from publishers for the older books. Viking used to say first published in March 1943. Then after that, it would say second printing, third printing, fourth printing underneath. Another thing you mentioned, paperback original. There are, in the science fiction area in particular, which is where I got started primarily because of my son, many paperbacks in the 30s, 40s, 50s even, science fiction were paperback originals, which almost invariably had number lines or said first edition on it. So if you're into science fiction, that is an area where first printings, first editions are paperbacks. As Laurie mentioned, with very few exceptions, there were book clubs that were first hardcover, again, almost exclusively in the science fiction area, because the paperback was the original, and then the book club published the hardcover. So hardcore collectors will also collect that hardcover because it's the first hardcover. Something else I want to mention in terms of buying online. And I don't know much about how Laurie lists her books, but it is a scary proposition. Unfortunately, what the internet has done is two things. They have undercut legitimate dealers, unfortunately. And again, I say I'm not a seller, but I know many dealers who had to go out of business. And they also, for the most part, unless they're a reputable seller, don't talk about the condition of a book. And that's something I think I want to mention as well. And that is, if you're a collector, a bona fide collector, then condition is probably the first thing that you have to consider. And this is what I learned from the two people that taught me, 40 plus years ago. And that is, aside from the idea of a first edition, first printing, in collecting purposes, condition is critical. For a book, for example, what I want in collecting a book is in the book, forget about the dust jacket for a moment or set it aside, is I don't want a book that has bumped edges or bumped corners if I can help it, or if it doesn't, the spine is not split or is not ready to come apart. Or it doesn't have mildew on it, or it's not fox. And foxing, I'll let Lori come back and talk about foxing if she doesn't mind. But foxing is basically what happens when book becomes mildewed and it eats the paper. It's acid paper, and the paper becomes yellowish or spotted. In terms of dust jackets, it's critical for collecting that if a book had a dust jacket in the first place, which most do, that the dust jacket also not have tears or rips or chips. Although in many instances you're not going to find, if you find a pristine dust jacket for a rare book, if it's got some chips on it, even a tiny tear, you get it. Many books, if I've come across books where there wasn't a dust jacket and it may have been a somewhat collectible book, I still wouldn't get it. In part because I tried to keep my collection as pristine as possible. Another thing on books, Laurie mentioned, book clubs generally don't have, well, they never have prices on the inside flap on the top or the bottom. If you see a book that's price clipped, especially on the bottom, where it would say maybe beware of whether it's a book club. And it does diminish to a limited extent the value of the book if it's price clipped, because then it raises the issue of whether it's a book club. I'm trying to think. Oh,
Bill,
again,
while you finish talking, can I show the group? I'm just going to share some pictures of the books that you donated to us because you mentioned condition, and I wanted to show the condition. They're beautiful.
Okay, so, and I just want to finish at this point. Again, going back to buying online, as I say, if they don't have a description of the book, I just stay away from it. I don't get into it at all. On occasion, if I want a book, and I didn't buy many books online, I was able to do it mostly by going to garage sales, estate sales, is if I can't reach the seller, to ask that seller to have that book in hand and tell me the description, I won't buy it from that seller. As a final note, there are what I call mass market sellers online. And there are three of them that I can mention. One is called Discover Books. The other is called Thrift Books. And the third one is called Better World Books. And they are literally mass market where they get the books from. And I would stay away from, unless you just want it for reading purposes. I would stay away from getting books from these because they could be ex-library. That's another thing Will can mention. Ex-library books are ones that literally have been culled from the library and put into circulation for selling, and they have library markings on them. They'll have maybe still the pocket. They'll have stamps on them. They are not collectible at all. And so you stay away from ex-library books as well. Other than that, I think that was all I really wanted to talk about in terms of, falling back on that wonderful presentation from Laurie.
Thank you so much, Bill. That is wonderful. And yeah, I'm just showing a few wonderful scans of just the covers of some of the materials that you donated to us. And as you all can
now
see,
that I see them, I want them back so I can sell them.
Oh, I will say they are in such pristine condition. I mean, they are amazing. And so we feel so grateful to have these. So
it was my pleasure to be able to find a wonderful home for them.
Oh yeah, it's incredible, and people are so impressed by them. One thing I wanted to ask you, of course, you've donated all these amazing books to the Rare Book Room. Can you share a few memorable experiences that you've had finding first editions by these different authors, particularly these African American authors, and sometimes even getting them signed. Because you said you didn't use the internet for many of these. So what did you do?
Well, going back over 40 years, there was a time if you were going out to estate sales and garage sales where books like these were available. It's not too much anymore. And of course, I also have to say that at the beginning of the pandemic, after 40 years, I decided to pretty much go cold turkey on collecting. I will say that I've got over 20,000 books at home, many, many, many of which are signed. And one of the reasons I went cold turkey is that when the authors weren't coming around for book signings anymore, where I got many, many of my books signed, and I also was very fortunate that I was able to send books over the years to authors by mail or FedEx. And fortunately, with very few exceptions, they came back, which was I was very good. But I probably send out several hundred boxes of books over the years to authors, including Toni Morrison and Maya Angelou. You know, Toni at Princeton, where I had befriended, I say her assistant. I was able to get many, many of her. I saw her one time, though, in 1996. They had a cultural Olympiad here in Atlanta at Agnes Scott, where many very, very famous authors, particularly Black authors who came, including Toni Morrison, including Albert Murray, um, uh, Margaret Walker, who I had to babysit for about an hour, which was a fantastic experience. Her book Jubilee was one of the classic original African American authors. Um, so I was able over the years, as I say, to get many, many of my books signed. And there were so many authors that used to come through Atlanta. Of course, that in more recent years, forgetting about COVID, the publishers have cut back on sending authors out. So you don't see nearly as many. Plus, you don't have bookstores. There's only three places really that have authors come. It's the Georgia Center for the Book at the Decatur Library, the Atlanta History Center, and the Carter Center. Other than that, there are very few bookstores. Barnes and Noble used to have people come all the time in various locations. They pretty much have stopped that. There are very few book signings, if any, at Barnes and Noble anymore, and a few other bookstores that do it, but not nearly as many as they used to have in terms of authors. So I had a wonderful run of many, many stories of people that I met over the phone, that I met over the internet. It was really a wonderful, wonderful experience to be able to have a hobby like that.
That is marvelous. Can you tell us? I think you told me a story about getting some books signed by Gloria Naylor. Did she sign like almost
Oh
all
yeah,
of them?
okay. Well, this is interesting. That's another place, the Shrine of the Black Madonna, Black bookstore that I used to go to when authors came. There were a lot of Alice Walker came. Well, Gloria Naylor came one time, and I had a whole batch of books. And what I do is I wait to the end after everybody's got their books signed, and I go up and she's like, I'm not going to sign all those books. Well, it turns out that I don't remember how I found out, but she went to the same high school as my wife, but many years before. And I started talking to her about that. And so so she signed all my books. So otherwise I don't know how many books I would have gotten signed instead of the maybe 8 or 10 that I had with me. But that was another thing. When I went to book signings, the people at Barnes and Noble and anywhere else that I went, if I had more than 2 or 3 books, I would wait to the end after everybody had their book signed, and virtually all the time the authors were grateful for that. And of course, the bookseller, the places were grateful. And it also gave me an opportunity to talk to them while they're signing my books, instead of just putting a book down and they sign it and I walk away. So that was also part of the fun of book collecting.
That's amazing. Again, nurturing relationships with authors. I think that is something that, again, like you said, it's amazing that you were able to do that. And again, it required that in-person contact with them. So I think
I'll give you
that is
another story. Another one of my favorite friends, who was actually a friend, was Pat Conroy.
Mhm.
Back in the 1980s, early 80s, when I was first starting, there was an article in the paper about Pat. So I went to Old New York bookstore, Cliff Graubart, who was one of the people that taught me how to collect, and he still sells online. And I asked Cliff about Pat, should I be collecting him? He said, "Oh, absolutely." Okay, so I walked out of the store, and he said, Bill, come back in." I walked back in and said, "I want to introduce you to Pat Conroy," who was at the store. He used the store as a place to write his books. Well, an hour later, I left. And Pat and I became good friends. And one of the books I have is to Bill Berger, who has more Conroy than Conroy. So this is, because I have a first edition of the Boo. The other thing that I love is the Great Santini. I have it signed by his father, Don, who wrote an entire page trying to justify that he wasn't the ogre that Pat made him out to be. So, those are the kinds of things that really are precious to me. I can never let a book like that go because I don't know
Absolutely.
what I'm going to do with the books that I've got now. Except continue to donate to places like Kennesaw State and the Booth Western Museum when I get books on the West and other places. What I have to do more of that is get the books into the university libraries. And
Absolutely.
I could finish with one other story is James Michener. I collected Michener. I didn't. I without getting into the genesis of it, I was able to get a Tales of the South Pacific, a first edition, first printing, and started to collect him because of that. I didn't want to collect him because his books were so big and took up too much shelf space. Well, over the years, I was able to get books signed by him. So I have a complete collection of all of his books, including British editions, forwards, prefaces, etc. And back in 1992, I was invited to his 90th birthday party in Austin, which I went to. And it was just a phenomenal weekend to have met him and talked to him about the books that he wrote.
That is absolutely incredible. This could go on forever. Just all these stories.
Yeah, well, it could, but I won't let it.
Okay, well, it's so interesting again for those of us who are, more so starting out. I have one final question for you. For those of us who are starting out, maybe developing our own collections, what kind of because again, what your path to collecting will probably look different for us because again, there's the internet and COVID happened, so maybe things are a little bit different. So what advice would you give to a budding collector who's trying to identify and acquire first edition books?
Well, today it's much easier. Again, it depends on how far back you want to go. I started collecting 40 years ago, which was 1980 approximately. So I was going back to authors that were from the 30s, 40s, 50s. Faulkner when I could find it, or Steinbeck, or Fitzgerald. Not easy, believe me. And the other thing I did, I would just say, and again, this is not something I would when I was working, I was able to travel in the Southeast. I would go to cities and bring books with me, not necessarily fiction books, but nonfiction, and trade them with book dealers in other cities. And I did it here too. I did that until all these bookstores went out of business. So I built up my collection also by trading books. I would find books and then I would go to the bookstore and they would give me trade credit and I would get the books that I wanted as they came in to fill in my collection. Um, Unfortunately, for collectors today, there are very few options to buy books, especially estate sales or garage sales. You don't generally find anything really, really good anymore. And if you do go, you've got dealers who are there who are going to be in line 2 hours before it opens to get the books, especially if they know or have a feeling that there's a hoard or a load of books. So you're not going to be able to really find books anymore like that. And I stopped going years ago anyway. Um, there are bookstores. There's Second and Charles in Kennesaw, and they're opening up a new one in Roswell in a couple of weeks, um, where books are priced relatively cheaply, and you can go on, depending on who the author is, especially modern authors, people that are still publishing. You can find books there. There's half-price books, which I don't like as much, frankly, just on a personal level. Uh, and then of course there's the internet, but then the internet it's a pit, and you have to be so leery. There aren't, in my view, there aren't that many legitimate sellers out there. I have, and it's too bad, because it really has ruined the ability for legitimate dealers to sell. And I saw that happening for a long time now. I would advise, for the most part, unless you really want a rare book and you are able to know for sure that it is, what they're representing it to be leery about buying books online. In terms of collecting, I'm talking strictly about collecting now, because you almost never, you don't know. You could very easily end up with a book club edition because people don't know, or they're scamming you or something. So it's not the same as it was 40 plus years ago at all.
Mm-hmm. Thank you.
I think, if you got, I don't know if you got time even to go, but if people want to ask questions of Lori and me, please, let's open it up.
Yeah, we have just a couple minutes left. We've had a wonderful discussion in the chat. Does anyone have questions for either Lori or Bill?
I guess not.
No
I have a
questions?
question for Mr. Berger.
Okay.
Yes, go ahead. Sure.
Mr. Berger, when you
It's Bill.
oh, thank you, Bill. Thank you. When you met your authors, your favorite authors, and they inscribed, I would value your opinion on an inscribed book over just I know we don't like this term, a flat signed
A flat sign.
book.
I prefer it just signed. Unless there's something really special about the inscription.
Mhm.
Unfortunately, I have to say this, when I sent books to authors by mail, more often than not, they came back to Bill Berger with appreciation or whatever. And for saleable purposes, which I was never into, they become less valuable.
Mhm.
No question about it. Because somebody who wants a book, unless it's really, really rare,
Mhm.
is not all that interested in having the book inscribed to Bill Berger or Laurie Meadows.
Mhm.
So I prefer to have it just signed. The other thing that I would do, and I'll just add here, is when the book was brand new and the author was coming and it was within a week or a month of the publication date, I would have them date the book as well, because that adds value to it.
Mhm.
I'll give you one more story. I used to go see Jimmy Carter quite frequently, and probably 99% of his signatures are J. Carter. And he could sign 10 books in a minute
Mhm.
in an assembly line. Well, I got to know him in a sense, and every once in a while I would like to get it Jimmy Carter, because those are rare. So I'd hand it to him and I say, Mr. President, can you give me a Jimmy? He'd sign Jimmy and he'd hand it back to me. And I'd look at him and I said, Mr. President, and then he'd take it back and add Carter. So that was sort of a cute thing. But those are, again, a little bit rarer. Larry McMurtry, who I have a complete collection of as well, except for the last couple of books, his signature changed over time, where his original signatures, you could see Larry McMurtry. In later days, you could just see a line. So sometimes you have to know this in terms of signatures. One more story, and again, it's a Black author, is Alex Haley. I had a signed edition that I bought of Roots. When I went back home one time to Rochester, New York, where I grew up, I found an alleged signed copy of Roots, and I didn't know so I bought it or traded for it, brought it back, and the two signatures were totally different.
Oh,
totally.
wow.
So I was able to track him down in East Tennessee, and I wrote him a letter, and I sent him copies of the two signatures, and he mailed back a whole page of which one was the legitimate one, how it was unfortunate that people would do that. But it's a lovely letter. So I have the two books and the letter together.
Oh my goodness, that is amazing. Oh, I hadn't heard that story. That was a really, really good one, and
Andrew,
I'm so
you're on
glad.
mute.
Well,
Andrew, okay.
I have just one question real quick for both of y'all. What's the favorite book in your collection? I know that can be a hard one to pick sometimes, but
Well, I have a first edition, first printing of the Boo, with Pat Conroy's book. Um, I was able also, just another story. Stephen King came to this Savannah Book Festival several years ago, and somehow or other, it was really something. I ended up getting 10 books signed by him, and all these were 10 of his, the early ones from Carry On. So that was wonderful. I have a first edition, first printing sign of The Killer Angels by Michael Shera, which these are things that I would treasure. Uh, in terms of signed books, all first edition of Salinger's Catcher in the Rye, but not signed because he never signed any books. Go ahead, Lori, go ahead.
Oh, I have two that very quickly are on my short favorite list. And one of them is The Chosen Valley by Margaret Snyder, 1948. And Joellen, you may have seen me post about this in the Facebook group. One of my husband's relatives wrote that book about a pioneer town in, I think it was Minnesota. So it was a very accurate account of the development of that area. And then there was the time that I bought somebody's pseudonym. I purchased a book back when eBay was brand spanking new, 25 years ago. And I bought the book by an author named Seamus Cullen, who was, that was a pseudonym for a different writer. And they researched who this person was, and I'm trying to remember who it was. It was a book critic that actually reached out to him, figured out the real identity, and the author was really, really mad that the critic had figured out who he was. And they said he was very ugly to him on the phone. So, but at that time, only two or three people in the world knew who this person was. And I was one of them. That was really cool. But then, 15 years later, everybody found out, and my little book went down in value. But it was fun. It was cool. I owned somebody's identity for a really short time.
What was it ultimately?
Oh, I'm going to have to. I tell you what, if you've got, I hate to keep the group, but I can look real quick and tell you.
Was it somebody famous?
I think it was a known author. I have to see if I put it in my post. Astra. The name of the book, and this is actually kind of an adult book, but Astra and Flandrix is the title. And okay, so it's 1976 publication. Seamus Cullen. Oh, John Clute was the reviewer, and he's the one that figured out who the person was.
That's another interesting thing. Talk about pseudonyms.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, I'm sorry, guys. We are going to have to end it though. I really would love to keep talking. It's just we're a little bit after our time.
Sure.
I'm so sorry, but we will definitely revive this conversation because there's so much to talk about with book collecting. So we can't fit it into 1 hour. Bill, you told me it would be hard to fit it.
Yeah, I mean, between Lori and myself, I mean, obviously there's more than an hour. So, I thought I will just make a comment. I thought that for a first time situation, for people, I thought this was really, really informative for people who want to do book collecting. I thought it was extremely well done, and I thank you for the opportunity to participate.
Absolutely. We can make it a little recurring series. I think that would be really fun to talk about book collecting. That would be amazing. Well, thank you all so much for joining us, and we will see you next month for our program. So I'll be sending out information about the next time that we meet. So thank you, everybody.
You keep me on your list, Joy Ellen.
I will. I'm going to keep you on the listserv. That's from now on. So yay.
Yep.
Very exciting.
Thank you. And Lori, I'll give you a call and we'll talk about maybe you can use some of my stuff.
Would love that. Bill, it was
Okay.
nice to meet you.
You too.
Thanks.
Take care.
Thank
Thank you,
you.
Joy Ellen.
Bye, everybody.
And I've got those couple of other books for you, and I actually have probably a couple other things as time goes on too.
Perfect. Love it. Thank
Okay,
you so
thanks.
much, Bill. Bye.
Take care.
Bye, everybody.
Bye-bye.
Bye.
Bye.